Nice to be here tonight. Thank you for inviting me, Jacob. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to sharing with all the other experts in the town hall tonight about American ginseng. I work with the Department of Natural Resources here in Georgia, so I work for the state government. And my part of the Department of Natural Resources is Wildlife Conservation section. And so in our section broadly, we're responsible for conservation and consultation on rare species in the state of Georgia and on their habitats. And we work towards conserving our state's biodiversity as a whole. So that's our main mission. And one part of that is working with the conservation of ginseng in Georgia. Ginseng is a beautiful and intriguing forest herb. It's most known for really in popular culture for its medicinal value. And that's the main reason we're here tonight to talk about growing and harvesting ginseng because of the strong interest that the people have in it for its medicinal value, and that also brings it economic value, which can help people add a little to their income. And it's also really fun to grow and to learn about because it's such a fascinating plant. So for my portion of the talk tonight, I'll be talking about conservation of the ginseng in the sense a little bit about the plant. Where does ginseng grow? What are some of the features of American ginseng? And why is ginseng considered rare in Georgia? And then I'll also go into regulation of Georgia ginseng, in particular, the harvest and sale of ginseng in Georgia and in the United States. Now, why are there regulations about ginseng? Why is it important that there's some control on the harvest? And what are ginseng regulations in Georgia? And how do you find out about regulations, beyond this talk today? So here's a picture that shows where American ginseng grows in Georgia, across its entire range. So this map shows its entire range. And you can see on this map, different states in the United States and in Canada, this American ginseng is native to North America broadly. And you will also notice that each state here is colored different color. And this information is provided to us by a group of conservation scientists that work with NatureServe. And all states provide data to NatureServe about their rare species. And the different colors that NatureServe has used in this map indicate how rare they're estimating ginseng to be in those states. So the bright red states, for example, ginseng is considered to be critically imperiled, so threatened with endangerment, critically imperiled. In Georgia, you can see Georgia is colored a yellow. It's a yellow color, which indicates it's vulnerable to imperilment in the state. I will note that this is an older assessment. We have not worked for a long time on reassessing the conservation status in Georgia. And over the past 10 years, we've been doing some monitoring in the Department of Natural Resources and find that on North Georgia, for example, in the Chattahoochee National Forest in North Georgia, there are indications that ginseng has declined in the past 10 years. Another nice, interesting thing to note about this map is that Georgia is one of the southernmost states where ginseng is found naturally. American ginseng is found naturally. And so that means that here in Georgia, this species experiences probably warmer climates, a little harsher climate than it does in other parts of its range, because it's at the very southernmost part of its range here, where most of the species occurs up north. So what that means is that the habitat, the home for ginseng in Georgia, is very special habitat. That is one of the other intriguing things and wonderful things about this plant is because it grows in some of the most beautiful places you can imagine. Ginseng requires the sheltered protection, the cool forest of mature, older hardwood forest, undisturbed forest where the soil has been allowed to accumulate over time rich organic material and is not heavily disturbed or eroded. So the soil has gotten thick, full of organic material, it's very rich, it's stable. The ginseng needs that. It needs sheltered slopes that are protected from sunlight in order to grow here in Georgia. And so these are some of the most beautiful places in our state. And that's another reason people just love to find ginseng, because of the magical places where it grows. Another feature about American ginseng that is so fascinating is it's a very long-lived plant. I have in this picture here, I have a couple of pictures of ginseng plants. Now, it's hard to tell from the photos, but these are fairly short plants. Ginseng is not a shrub. It's not woody. It's not got a woody stem. It's a small herbaceous plant. These plants are maybe a foot, maybe 2 feet high at the most. But these pictures here show very old plants. Now, one way you can tell about how old ginseng is, really roughly though, is their age is correlated, or means it's related to how many leaves the plant has. So if you look closely at this picture, you'll see that the leaves look like they're in shape, in a sort of held in a palm-like shape. And so what you see, each palm or each sort of cluster of 5 leaves is actually just 1 leaf, right? So the plant on the right has 3 clusters of 5 leaves. That's 3 leaves. A lot of people traditionally call a leaf a prong in ginseng. So that's 3 leaves on the right. If you look carefully at the plant on the left, that is a 4-prong plant. And 4-prong plants are now anymore in Georgia woods are really quite uncommon. Those are relatively very old plants. How do you actually tell about how old a ginseng plant is? So here's a picture that's a little bit more technical. It takes the seed a good while to germinate. They need to be exposed to summer conditions followed by winter conditions to stimulate them to grow. So they need a little cold snap before they'll grow. And then plants for up to 2 years probably only have 1 leaf or 1 prong. And if the soil conditions are good and they continue to mature for 3 to 6 years, they probably only have 2 leaves. That's it. So each year, this is kind of like a tree in a way. The leaves die. They fall back in the fall, in the autumn. They senesce. The nutrients are brought into the roots. And then that same root will sprout again the next year. So that root continues to grow and gain resources and energy. It holds the energy for the plant over the winter. And so as the root progresses to grow, the plant can get larger. But it takes 7 to 9 years for the plant to become mature enough to even have flowers. So a decade-old plant is one that can probably start to reproduce. It's pretty impressive when you think about a lot of plants that you'll get seed and flowers from in their first year. I don't know how long ginseng can grow, but it is not impossible that a ginseng plant can be 50 or more years old in the woods. The picture on the right is showing a ginseng stem. It's a very close-up of the ginseng stem. So on the top of the root, each year, the stems and the leaves grow. So you can see that the stem elongates. Each year you get another year of growth. The stem elongates, and then when the stem falls off, at the end of the year, it makes a scar on the stem. And so then the following year, the stem continues to grow. So you can estimate the age of a ginseng plant by looking at that older leftover stem at the bottom of where the ginseng plant falls off each winter. And you can really, it takes a little bit of practice and expertise, you can count the lines on that old stem, or they call it like a neck between the root and the bottom of the young stem is called a neck. And you can count the lines on that and estimate the years that that plant has been alive. Another feature about American ginseng is that it reproduces very slowly. It doesn't make new baby plants frequently, and the conditions have to be just right for those plants to grow. So it takes a long time for it to make seed. Those seeds may or may not fall in the right soil conditions, and they may or may not grow. And so to grow a ginseng population naturally takes a very long time. American ginseng roots, like I mentioned, and y'all probably know, they're prized for their medicinal value. They've been prized, American ginseng has been prized pretty much since Europeans have began coming over to the Americas. They knew about American ginseng because of the trade in Asian ginseng, which is a very closely related plant that grows in different parts of Asia, not only China, but Korea and Japan. There is also ginseng over there. So it was already known to the European culture because of their trade with Asia. American ginseng is just one of the vast cornucopia of phenomenal diversity of medicinal plants that grew in Eastern North America that were very well known by the native peoples here, by their nations and tribes. And it's only one part of their large medicinal repertoire, most of which that knowledge is gone now. But American ginseng is one that is well known because Europeans already knew about it when they came over. And it is believed that the American ginseng roots have more potent medicinal value than Asian ginseng roots. So there was, as soon as the Europeans discovered it, there was an instant demand for American ginseng. And so it has been important in trade ever since the beginning of the colonies and before that. Millions and millions and millions of pounds have been exported from the United States, from Canada, from North America to Europe and to Asia. You can see the roots pictured here. And there are some interesting features of these roots. So I'm going to use my mouse to kind of, I think I'll try the mouse. I don't know if I have other tools, but if y'all can see, I'll circle the main part of the root that's underground. Whoops. You don't want to advance too quickly there. So you can see the underground portion of these roots. And then you can see what I call the neck, or the base of the older stems that remains after the fresh plant falls off each year. And you can look at these and you can see that these are very old ginseng roots. You can imagine trying to find that. You can sort of see that little line. You can't really count them here in this photograph, but you can tell there's lots of small lines on these necks, and these are very, very old plants. And you can see the roots are still quite small. I'm sorry, I don't have anything up here for scale, but they're just a few inches long. To the right is a very, very old ginseng root that you don't find very infrequently. So these are all very valuable roots. And these are all from Eastern North America, American ginseng. In general, the medicinal value of American ginseng is known to be, thought to be, understood to be that it's a general, for overall tonic for benefiting your health, vigor and energy, and longevity. So those are the general features that people attribute to American ginseng. So now, why is American ginseng rare? And in particular, why is it rare in our area, in Georgia? Overall, habitat decline has caused there to be less places that ginseng can grow because it's very picky, as I mentioned, because it's growing in the southern part of its range. It needs a very particular habitat here in Georgia, and urbanization, logging, different types of agriculture, just more people here in the Georgia landscape. It just means that there's more disturbance and there's less mature, older hardwood forests that have undisturbed soil. It's just harder for ginseng to live in Georgia now than it used to be. Another thing about ginseng is that to certain animals, it is delicious. They love to eat ginseng, in particular deer eat a lot of ginseng. I am aware that turkey, other types of birds do favor the fruits of ginseng, but in particular, deer are most notorious for eating ginseng, the whole tops of the plants. And you can imagine that if your top is chopped off every year successfully over and over, that your roots are going to get smaller. You're not going to get enough energy, and the plant will eventually die. And it does take a little while, but after being eaten for many years in a row, the ginseng plants just decline. And there have been a large increase in deer or pressure on, because there's pressure on the ginseng habitats due to deer. There's some more deer, but there's also less food for deer, less habitat for deer. So there's a lot of pressure on these hardwood habitats where deer grow, and a lot of plants in there are suffering because there's just so many deer and they are eaten a lot. And because overall, in reproduction, growing new ginseng plants, that's inherently slow for ginseng. It's hard for them to bounce back from habitat decline and herbivory. And on top of that, if you add that there's a very high demand for the ginseng root, on top of that, that's an additional pressure on ginseng. And so ginseng is becoming more rare in Georgia and in the Northeast in general, in the eastern woods in general. However, trade in American ginseng, I mentioned already how important it was to early colonizers of the Americas, to early inhabitants of the United States when it was became a country, and it's still important for people who use forest products as part of their living. Ginseng trade is legal, and it is a very small part of Georgia's economy, in particular because we don't have as much ginseng as some of our surrounding states. We have a small trade in ginseng, but it's still a part of Georgia's culture and Georgia's heritage. So in order to work to balance the trade in ginseng, to keep it a legal trade that's sustainable, we have regulations. And the regulations just help balance the trade with the needs of the species to survive. So our goal in regulating ginseng is to create a sustainable trade that people and families can do for generations, and not just wipe out ginseng populations just unknowingly. Maybe you may not even know any better just from overharvesting without knowledge. So the regulations are combined knowledge of lots of scientists as well as people in the ginseng industry and in the trade to try and create a balanced system for harvesting ginseng. So this system is driven in Georgia by what we call the Georgia Ginseng Program. And there's some laws. I'm going to do a little legal speak. There's some laws that authorize us, that give us power to have a Georgia Ginseng Program. One of these laws is a treaty. It's an international treaty. And the treaty is called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So this treaty has regulations about all kinds of species that are traded, from elephants to ginseng. Ginseng is listed in this treaty, and there's certain rules that we have to follow in order to have a legal trade in ginseng. So United States is a party on this treaty. We signed this treaty, and And so because of that, each state that wants to have a legal trade in ginseng has to have some rules in their state government to demonstrate that they're doing responsible trade. And so we have in Georgia a Georgia Ginseng Protection Act, and it was passed in 1979. It's been around a little while, been around a little longer, but it has been around a little while. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Georgia Ginseng Act. And then each year, Georgia is responsible for reporting to the United States government, which is in this case the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, about our trade in ginseng, and they let us know if they consider it sustainable or not, and they allow us. They're the ones that officially allow us to have a legal trade in ginseng. So we have responsibility to report to the Fish and Wildlife Service every year. This is a little bit about how ginseng sale and export works in Georgia. So in the state of Georgia, you'll have folks who dig wild ginseng or grow and harvest cultivated ginseng, one or the other. And the diggers sell their ginseng to dealers in the state of Georgia. And in order to be a legal dealer, you have to register with us, the Department of Natural Resources. And you have to report all of your purchases to Department of Natural Resources. The same thing, if you're going to grow ginseng, you have to report anything you harvest to Department of Natural Resources. And the purpose of all this reporting, so we can have some idea of how much is dug and harvested in the state. We can get the best idea of how much ginseng is contributing to the economy and about how much is harvested. So that's why we require reporting. And then also after that, if a dealer or a grower is going to sell ginseng out of state, it has to be certified so that anybody who looks at that ginseng can verify, can document, yes, this was legally harvested, it's okay, it's ethically produced, and it goes with that banner, yes, this is ginseng that is, to the best of our ability, not causing harm to the species. So that certification form, it allows you to export ginseng out of state. So those are two important steps to keep in mind for from the Georgia government point of view. So we receive how much ginseng is being harvested and grown in Georgia. And we also certify ginseng for export. So here are the basic steps that we do in Department of Natural Resources for the Georgia Ginseng Protection Act in the Georgia Ginseng Program. So I already mentioned anyone who is going to buy wild ginseng or grow ginseng for export or for sale, even for sale locally, has to register with us. It just helps us track how much ginseng is being sold in Georgia. And it doesn't cost anything to register. It's very easy. Okay. This is when you can harvest ginseng, whether you're growing it or whether you're digging it. It's from September 1st to December 31st. That's the harvest season. That's by law. Can't change it. The purpose of that is so that, I'm going to back up a little. The purpose of that is so that ginseng is allowed to spend the whole summer growing and making flowers and fruit, dropping those fruits so that those populations can be sustainable. That is a very, very important thing to keep in mind. These laws are made for the plants, not for the government. They're made for the plants so that the plants have a good chance at survival. So we don't allow any harvest until September 1st. So those plants have a chance to reproduce. It's so critical for that population. There is no harvest allowed on state-owned land. So we consider that land public, the public value. No one's allowed to profit from ginseng on state-owned property. No permit system for harvesting from the state. So we also, in the law, The law encourages plants of an older age only to be harvested. Plants with 3 or more prongs or 3 or more leaves to be harvested. And any berries that you get from those plants, you nurture those berries. You pluck them from the plant, you nurture them, you plant them in a little bit of soil on site. This gives them a much better chance of growing than even if they just fell on the leaf litter. So you're helping the population along. These are parts of the law that help the plants have a chance to reproduce in the wild. And as I've already mentioned, all your harvest, whether it's wild or cultivated ginseng, must be reported to Department of Natural Resources and must be certified before it being exported out of the United States. And Department of Natural Resources takes care of that for you as well. It's part of our job. Any violations of the law are considered misdemeanors in the state of Georgia. I'll be happy to take questions on these. So for those of you who are interested in growing ginseng, this is important knowledge here on this next slide. So what is considered wild ginseng in the state of Georgia and what is considered cultivated ginseng? So in Georgia, what we call wild is truly wild ginseng that's growing completely unassisted by people. But there's also what generally in the culture is known as wild simulated ginseng. So you can plant the ginseng, planted by humans. You can plant the ginseng, you can take the berries, you can plant them, you can guard them a little bit from herbivory, from turkey and deer, but you don't manipulate the soil. You don't add fertilizer, you just leave that woods grown soil and let the ginseng grow as basically almost as they would naturally. You don't tend the plants, fertilize the plants, but you can plant the berries and guard the patch from herbivory. That's considered wild in the state of Georgia. It's experiencing basically the same thing a wild plant would experience in the woods. Cultivated ginseng also has some varieties in Georgia. So legally, we consider cultivated ginseng both as woods grown ginseng and intensely grown in an agricultural setting ginseng. So woods grown ginseng is cultivated. You may plant rows, you may fertilize it, you might decide to manipulate it in some way, but it's grown under a canopy in a forested setting. You might amend the soil, you might change it a bit to make it grow more quickly, other things like that. But it's called woods grown, but it's manipulated to the extent where, yeah, it's considered cultivated ginseng. And the right situation, purely cultivated in more of an agricultural setting, is pretty obvious. Now, I will let you all know that in the trade, wild ginseng is considered more valuable. It's considered more potent medicinally, traditionally, and the evidence for that is coming in that the plant itself has a harder time growing. It's a little bit harder. It accumulates more of these chemicals in the root that are considered medicinal. And why is that? Well, if a plant faces tougher conditions, it generally tends to accumulate more protective chemicals. And the medicinal chemicals are in that people find valuable for medicinal are often chemicals that protect the plant in harsh conditions. So in general, wild ginseng has been considered more valuable in the trade. However, wild ginseng is becoming more rare, and we strongly value and would support growers of ginseng to take pressure off of our wild populations. So here's a couple dry pages of this presentation, but I wanted to show you a couple of our forms that we use for reporting to the Department of Natural Resources, different aspects of your ginseng trade. So this is a relatively simple form where you're showing the harvest of the ginseng. So this would be a transaction where you're either purchasing ginseng from a digger or where you're harvesting ginseng and selling it. And what is important to know is the name and address of who's buying the ginseng or who's selling it to you. Where was the ginseng collected? What county was it from? What part of the state? So we know where the harvest is occurring. How much is obvious, whether it's green, meaning it hasn't been dried, or dry ginseng that's been dried down, the water weight's gone, and whether it's wild or cultivated. These are really important things for us to track in the state of Georgia. So that's an example of the kind of form that you're required to fill out by law as a registered grower or dealer of ginseng. And here's showing our ginseng shipment certificate. Now, again, this is the certificate that allows the ginseng to be exported from the state of Georgia. It is not the same certificate that allows you to export ginseng from the United States. Georgia government isn't in charge of that. The Fish and Wildlife Service is in charge of that. So it's a different system. There's another permit for international export. But this certificate just demonstrates this is the amount of legal ginseng that's in this package. It's been checked over. We know it's valid. Everything is good with this ginseng. So if someone checks that package and sees that form, they know it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, and it's going to go on to where it's supposed to go. This is really important form to have with your ginseng if you're shipping it out of state. And I mentioned this earlier, and I'll say it again, Department of Natural Resources is responsible for doing the certification, and they will come to you and get that done for you. Here's just a little information to finish up. I wanted to show you over time, since the Georgia Ginseng program has been in existence, some of the trends you can see in the Georgia Ginseng harvest. So this is a really rough graph showing from way back in 1978 all the way through 2018, the total dry weight of wild ginseng. This is not cultivated ginseng, but wild ginseng that was reported by ginseng dealers in the state of Georgia for each year. You can see that in general, most often we have under 1,000 pounds, usually under 500 pounds of Georgia ginseng harvested or reported harvested in the state. So it's not a very large economy. Now, there is a black market for ginseng that we don't capture in this information, but this is to the best of our knowledge. And so there's another reason why it's really important to keep that legal trade, that reported trade of ginseng, so that we can have a sense of what our ginseng economy is doing and how important it is to the state. I will also say that cultivated ginseng used to be a large part, nearly half of the trade in ginseng in Georgia up until about 1995. And that is not shown on this graph. You don't see the dry weight of cultivated ginseng on this graph. But in 1995, between then and 2000, our bigger ginseng growers just stopped. And since that time, no one has successfully started a ginseng growing operation in the state of Georgia. And I am not sure what to attribute that to, but there are many factors that make it a little bit challenging to invest in a ginseng operation that does a lot of business, including the length of time it takes to grow, the susceptibility to herbivores like deer, turkey, maybe susceptibility to disease, maybe warming climate. I'm uncertain as to what the factors are, but it is very true that we have not had a lot of successful ginseng cultivators in the state of Georgia. And we've had a very small contingent of reliable ginseng growers, but they're just not making a lot of production. Here's another graph that's showing wild ginseng, the type of price that wild ginseng gets in Georgia, firsthand from the digger to the dealer. So this is the first transaction. How much per pound of dry and green ginseng over time has been the selling price for ginseng in Georgia. And you can see that the price has been relatively consistent, and in fact increasing between 2000 and 2018. In general, though, however, it's less than $800 a pound, hovering between $500 and $800 a pound generally in the state of Georgia for dry wild ginseng. I will tell you that last year, Georgia ginseng price was relatively high last year. Last year, it was about $850 a pound for dry wild ginseng in the state of Georgia. So I've talked a lot about some detailed laws and regulations in the Georgia Ginseng Management Program. So where can you go just to find these out, to research them, and to be sure you know what they are? And we have a webpage at the Wildlife Resources Division website about the ginseng program. And if I have a minute, it's up to Jacob. I could walk you all through that page a little bit. I've also posted our phone number for our office at the Wildlife Conservation section, that you can jot that down, and you can also call us for information. But we have worked hard on our ginseng page. It needs a few updates, but in general, we've put up information about the laws, also about conservation of ginseng, how to steward a ginseng patch, and how to grow ginseng. So there's some links to some valuable resources on that page. So I recommend visiting the page, and we're working to get those updates back in there so it's 100% current, but it's still a really nice page. And my name is Lisa Cruz. I've been involved with the ginseng program since 2005, and I'm supervising new botanists, which is exciting, who are learning the ginseng program, and their names are Gemma Millie and Carly Steppe, and they're also available to answer questions about the ginseng program if you were to call our number. At that, I'll leave it for any questions, unless Jacob would like me to flip to our webpage.
Sure, you can do that real quick.
Okay, I'll exit the slide. Do I need to maybe do a new share? Let's see, yeah, I'll try that. Let's see, how does that work? Screen, I'll do this. I'll go to the web page. Little box. Is that working?
I'm still just seeing your slides.
Did that work?
Yep, that's it.
Cool. All right, so this is our Ginseng Management Program page. There's a brief history at the top. It gives you the explanation as to why we have regulations in Georgia. Then there's a link here, which information for diggers, dealers, and growers, and it has for you information about the plant and aging the plant and what it looks like. And also, this is a very thorough list that explains the law for you right here and all the requirements. And that is a very good, just current resource on the law about ginseng in the state of Georgia. So that's right on our webpage. You could actually read the full law in all its lovely technical form if you would like to. And also, here's another important piece of information here is that the Chattahoochee Oconee National Forest, so the U.S. Forest Service, also is involved with ginseng. And there is ginseng that occurs on the national forest. Every year, the National Forest determines, well, are they going to allow harvest on their forest or not? And in the past 2 years, they stopped allowing harvest on the national forest. This is not a permanent change at this point, but it is uncertain. They demonstrated that there had been a significant decline of ginseng in the forest, and they are no longer issuing permits as of now to harvest ginseng on the Chattahoochee Oconee National Forest. So that's a recent change. It's important to be aware. You can always get updates from the link that's here on our page. So that's a very important place to visit, and you can also find out how to contact the U.S. Forest Service. So where is ginseng harvest legal in the state of Georgia? Since this year you can't get it from the national forest and you cannot dig it on state property, where you can dig ginseng is with permission of a private landowner. You have to have written or documented permission of that landowner. You can harvest or dig ginseng from that landowner. So that's very important to know. We also have some nice references here to stewardship of wild and cultivated ginseng. We do have a list of our registered dealers who will buy ginseng. We have information on exporting ginseng in the federal law that you need to follow in order to export ginseng from the United States to another country. And then just some other handy ginseng links and references, information about wild ginseng, how to grow ginseng, and different organizations that provide information on ginseng. And at the bottom, of course, is our contact information. So those are a lot of valuable resources that we have for you all on our webpage. If I flip back to the slide, then you all can see can you see our address and information again?
Yeah, your phone number's up there.
Great. That's all I got, but I'm happy to answer questions.
All right. Let's keep on moving right now. Let's move on to Margaret, just because of the time right now. There are a couple of questions in the chat, Lisa, if you don't mind, want to look through and maybe answer some of those in the chat.
Yeah, be happy to.
And yeah, so but let's see what because if you can stop sharing, let Margaret start sharing her screen.
Oh yeah, let's see. New share, stop share. There we go. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lisa.
Hello, everybody.
Hey.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Your screen popped up for a second, then it disappeared.
Okay, I'll just try it in slideshow mode. Okay. Let's see. Pardon. All right. Okay, can you see that?
Yep, there it is.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me tonight, Jacob, and everyone. Wow, I'm checking the participant numbers, and there's over 100 people on the session right now. So that's pretty amazing and speaks to itself about the interest in your counties and in Georgia. So that's great news. Hello, Lisa. Nice to meet you over Zoom here. What a fantastic presentation to set the stage for tonight on ginseng in Georgia. So my name is Margaret. I work in Western North Carolina for NC State, and I'm at the Mountain Horticultural Crops Research and Extension Center, which is just west of Asheville in Henderson County. So we are at about 2,200 feet and also near kind of the southern part of the Appalachian range, similar to y'all. And I have been asked to talk about cultivating ginseng. So Lisa talked a bit about how amazing and wonderful this plant is and some of the conservation and regulations there. So I am going to talk a bit more about my experience with cultivation of ginseng and kind of some of the trends with what we deem forest farming that are going on in the region right now. I did note some of your questions and we'll try to answer some of them from the chat as they regard to growing ginseng along the way if I can. And I'm just going to keep time here so we can be mindful of everyone's evening. So thanks for joining us again tonight. Here again is Panax quinquefolius, the wonderful American ginseng. One of the common names is manroot, and the picture on the right kind of shows how it can look like a person sometimes. Sometimes when we're working with roots, we have little characters because they do really look something like a person rather than a plant in that form. So of the woodland botanicals and forest botanicals I work with and are traded, both wild and now as we're seeing a little bit more cultivation, in that way, ginseng is by far the most popular, and that is for so many reasons that Lisa spoke to regarding tradition and culture, as well as the price point from the history of its cultivation and wild harvesting in the area. So the roots are usually harvested, but I'll also talk about that there's a growing market for ginseng leaves, as well as for seed and rootlets for planting stock for people to grow more ginseng. So as mentioned, wild harvesting is a long treasured tradition in our region from indigenous people who have had and continue to have relationships with this plant and the amazing habitats in which it resides. It's of course part of Appalachian mountain culture since Europeans settled and beyond. And it's understood that many wild harvesters are good stewards about ginseng patches and also concerned about conservation. And I think that's really important. Sometimes wild harvesters get a bad rap. Also good to note that it's common to have a saying patch in mountain homesteads over the years, to have a little patch of saying to get you through the holidays or through now a college account is something that some folks are planting seeds for their grandkids for. However, as we may know, overharvesting, habitat loss, which is one of the primary reasons, as well as climate change are all threats to our native population of ginseng all around its range, but in particular towards the southern part of the range where we're on the edge. So things that happen can affect these plants more. But it is wonderful to note that it can be cultivated and thus reduce pressure on wild populations while perhaps creating an income stream or a part of a diverse income stream for forest landowners. So as mentioned, ginseng can and we believe should be cultivated. Here's some beautiful pictures of ginseng berries harvested from some of our cultivated plants. Also ginseng seed in the bottom left, a rootlet, and one of the final products that ginseng may become as a symbol of status, as a wonderful gift, perhaps in an Asian market. So I came across this article from the 1975 New York Times when I was looking up some statistics on cultivation in Georgia earlier, and just to know that cultivating ginseng is not a new thing. So this is a report saying that ginseng root is, as stated, is a minor cash crop for Georgians. So that could be part of wild harvested events. But if you look up this article, and it is available online, you can read more about that. We've seen pictures of historical cultivation, both in cultivated shade beds, also to more of the wild types that Lisa introduced over time, all over its range. And these are huge amounts, tons and tons that the early Europeans would take out of the woods and also cultivate. We have USDA pamphlets on cultivating ginseng from 1915 on how to do it. That said, ginseng is a bit challenging to grow, especially out of its habitat. and how it's grown affects its appearance, which in turn affects its value. Ginseng, more than any other of our forest botanicals, and one of the plants in the world outside of the ornamental industry, is most judged by its appearance than any other. While the medicinal quality and constituents also have a big impact on, a price you might receive for this plant or this root, it's the appearance, particularly in the Asian markets, that really affect it. So you can see the cultivated root on the left, also known as a slick root, looks more like a big dried out carrot, and more of the kind of gnarly with the longer necks. As Lisa pointed out, the parts of the plant there with the leaf scars are more of the wild look. So if we're talking about the different production models that were introduced, there's 4 major ones, right, in today's cultivation, and that's artificial shade grown, and this is popular in the Midwest, in Ontario, Wisconsin, Michigan, and on some scales further to our area. This is intensive production. And it's important to note that this type of production doesn't really go to the high value markets that we've been discussing or the exports. A lot of this is cultivated and would be more found in the products you might find at the drugstore or in an energy drink or something coming from cultivated ginseng. Massive scales, usually very high input in terms of cost, as well as products like fungicides, fertilizers. So they can be grown like this, but that's not the same product that comes out. Talking more about the woods cultivated or woods grown, less productive than that high intensive shade cultivation we see elsewhere, but takes a lot longer to get a harvestable root. That said, it can be more natural and require less input by being in the woods. That said, this type can be intense and still use things like fungicides and fertilizers. And that's, of course, because it's outside of the way that ginseng grows in the wild. It's at such a dense population. So the wild simulated production and that a bit of the woods grown is what we'll focus on today in talking about starting a ginseng patch and what we really recommend as we attempt to have conservation through cultivation, as that term's been coined by many. So this wild simulated production, you get least expensive, however, you'll get the lower yields relative to the others, can be easier, less input of your time and labor often, and may take a longer time. But for ginseng, it's going to produce that more gnarly, wild looking, more valuable root. And there's some nice 4 prongs on the right, as Lisa mentioned, how we can talk about these plants by their leaves or prongs, as well as their age. So growing ginseng, your site selection is the most important factor. And there are certain things that can be modified. You can grow ginseng on your back porch in a pot. You can grow ginseng on a balcony in New York City. However, how that plant grows and how that root develops is going to be a lot different. So we can grow this plant a little bit out of its range or in a little bit of a stressed environment, but that's going to really show in terms of the root quality and the plant health, or vice versa. So some things to consider with site selection we get from understanding where these plants grow in the wild, from the work that folks like Lisa do, and from more research, like field-based research that we do in horticulture and forestry from the universities to, count things, look at shade percentages and all of that. So the hardwood and mature forest with that rich mesic form is really what ginseng thrives in. Elevation is important. I know that that was a question on the chat. And we often don't see elevation below about 1,000 feet or 300 meters. That said, it can grow. It's just, where does it thrive? Where does it grow well? And where is it found? So you want to get close to those things when you're assessing a site for ginseng. Slope. So ginseng likes to grow in a well-drained but rich soil. So you want to have a bit of a slope there to help with that drainage. And the aspects, it's traditionally thought that ginseng grows best on a north-facing aspect or north-facing hillside. However, east, northeast, northwest are also good alternatives. And again, depending on your mountainous region, you have so many different microclimates. So these are generalized things where we find ginseng may thrive, but you can adapt your situation or, kind of do best case scenario as well. That rich, moist, and well-drained soil, as we've talked about as well, and good airflow. So you want to have some air moving through the patch during times of the year, particularly when it's humid. And also want to speak that there are so many microclimates that one place may be really great for ginseng and another one, a stone's throw away, may not be. And again, observing how we see this plant grow in the wild is how we can best inform our wild simulated cultivation. Looking for companion or indicator plants, again, from what we see in the wild and where these plants grow. Also looking at other potential crops that you could grow in connection with ginseng is a good thing to think about here. So if you have a forested site that has things growing on it already, look for plants. If there's not ginseng on your space already, look for other forest medicinals that like those conditions. Take notes of those. Here pictured, we have some ferns. We have black cohosh and a Solomon seal. Another list of some of the indicator plants you might recognize or see what their common names are listed here. And there are many more. These are just kind of the herbaceous perennials on the forest floor. So looking to your tree species and other layers of the canopy can give you good indications as well. When we look for good sites for ginseng, we look down a lot. We look at our soil, we look at our plants, but it's also really important to look up. So looking at where these plants live and where might be a good spot for them. Looking up, we can get an idea of our shade level. And there are a number of ways to do this. The easiest way is when we're before leaf fall, so soon if not in our deciduous forests. You can go out and you can look up and you can take a picture. You can look up right above where you might make a ginseng patch and try to estimate the percentage of shade based on a printout or a screen average. There's also other models that you can use. There's our phone apps that you can look at now to give yourself a percentage shade if that's something you're interested in. But really we're looking at just very mild sunlight coming through the upper canopy in a prime ginseng habitat. Sometimes we have some shade levels of up to 90% in some areas we find ginseng, but we usually look at 75% or more. We have some colleagues in the Northeast doing some work right now, and they're thinking it's closer to 85 is the best spot for them. Regardless, you need a lot of shade, and you don't have to get technical or too much about it if you can see what is growing already on the surface of the soil or on the ground where you're growing. So shade can come in a number of ways, and I want to show all these different options because not everyone has access to forested land. Natural shade, even little patches of shade, or creating your own shade can be options here. When we're cultivating a crop, even if it's a wild type crop, we have to, of course, follow good agricultural practices. The one that may be most pertinent to ginseng, if you're handling it for sale, for example, are ones for medicinal herbs. This is a series of videos, and there's a bulletin out by Dr. Janine Davis, my boss, on that, and we could talk more of that, but just wanted to bring that in because we may think if we're in the woods, we might be different than when we handle a tomato, but we really need to treat anything that we're cultivating or harvesting with the utmost care. Also come more from a horticulture background in cultivating ginseng and always want to test and prepare the soil. Even if you're not planning on adding any amendments, it's good to know what you're dealing with. Here in North Carolina, we recommend doing a soil test through our state department, including the opportunity we have for checking for nematodes. Again, that's something we don't always see in the woods, but we have had some ginseng patches that have been overtaken by predatory nematodes. So check for those. If you need to, correct for any major deficiencies. What we often look to on those chemical soil analyses, if looking at it for ginseng or other woodland botanicals, are that pH. Ideally, you want it in that 5.5 to 6.5 range. Ginseng can go even lower than that. Oops, 4.5 and up. Soft spot though. You can add compost if you're doing a woods grown planting or other amendments. Gypsum is a popular one. There was some research on calcium levels in ginseng based off looking at ginseng where it grows best, and then seeing that a lot of those have types of stone in their bedrock and in their soil that has a lot of calcium in it. And so some people want to add that to try to mimic those conditions with the higher calcium. When you're sourcing seed or planting stock of ginseng or other forest farm botanicals, you really want to go for the high quality. This isn't something you want to go and get the cheapest price on. So like we mentioned, there's no legal harvest on state or federal lands, and that is in regard to any plant part, not just the roots, I imagine. So looking to cultivated sources or other sources may be something you want to do to start a cultivated patch. Positive species ID is important. Ginseng, of course, we have American ginseng and it's its own species there, but you just still want to know what you're getting and from where. So having the reputable folks to buy from is really important. What's really neat is these places that we look to usually for vegetable seeds like Johnny's and other seed companies are now carrying ginseng seed and ginseng rootlets and other things. So they're responding to this desire and this education out there to cultivate this plant or to include it even in a woodland garden, let alone to have a patch of your own in the woods. Of course, if you are harvesting, make sure you are doing it legally and sustainably to the best of your knowledge. So when cultivating ginseng, you need to clean and clear the site. So showing kind of dichotomy here, we've got up in Watauga County and near Boone, North Carolina. This is our extension, Dr. Jim Hamilton's woods grown method. So this is that intense woods grown style. On the right, we're preparing the site for a small patch for a wild simulated. For the woods grown ginseng, you can turn the soil, tiller, add those amendments as we've talked about. Some people are building raised beds, whether to grow them out or to grow them in a nursery type fashion. And again, the use of fungicides and herbicides are generally accepted in that way. Some more pictures of a woods grown system. You're going to want to cover those beds that you make with several inches of mulch. Use what you have first. We find that leaf mulch works best. So more of a wild simulated system and a method developed by Scott Parsons, who co-authored a book on cultivating and marketing ginseng and other woodland botanicals. This is kind of one of his methods. Rake aside the litter, leaf litter, throw your seeds in there. Then he's going to rake the leaves back over and he does a little dance over top of them. But that's just to remind you that you want to make sure those seeds come into contact with the soil. If you're doing it on a hillside, you could do it that way. You could then rake the leaves down over the first bed you made and start another bed above it. So we have some more kind of efficient ways if you want to plant a larger ginseng patch. So just getting some great pictures and ideas about the ginseng seed. As Lisa mentioned, ginseng seed needs to go through a stratification period. So it needs to have that warm and then it needs to be cold. And then when it warms back up, hopefully that dormancy has been broken. Oftentimes that's after its first year, but sometimes that's not till its second year. So it wouldn't be till the second year after you planted that seed that it could come up. So don't give up on them if you plant them and they don't come up right away, especially if you don't know if that seed, if purchased, had been stratified, which most folks do. So this is also showing the berry on the plant, the fresh seed. There's usually 2 seeds in there. Sometimes you get 1 or 3, but most often 2. And the center photo shows us fresh seeding. So you can do that, or you can mash them up and kind of ferment them and drain off that, which we'll go over in a minute, similar to what you would do to save a tomato seed. Then you can store those. That even if you process the seeds for storage, they do need to be kept moist. So storing them in clean Play sand that's a little bit moist and in the refrigerator is a good method for that. Here is the process I mentioned to clean those seeds, for storage. So you're mashing them, you're adding some clean water. You want to make sure that's not chlorinated at this point so that the berries and the mash can go through their fermentation cycle. Let it ferment for a little bit. Usually that pulp will rise to the top. You can drain them and wash them. You can do a 10% bleach rinse if you have any indication of there being disease or anything in the growing or handling of that. Another way to do the cold stratification, other than in sand in the refrigerator, is to bury that right out in your nursery or in your bed, and it can go through those cycles naturally. I always like to do the least work, so that's me planting them right in the ground. Instead of putting them in the fridge, we just buried these flats that have screened bottoms, put in the seed, and allow them to go through the seasons pretty close to where they end up being planted. If you are going to do that, you'll dig them up after a year and then can sow the seeds, or as mentioned, you can fresh seed. If you don't know where your patch is going to be, or you want to experiment with growing these ginseng from seed, you can start a nursery. And here's some kind of low-tech options for nurseries that we do. We then plant these out as 1 or 2 year old rootlets. Ginseng doesn't really like to be transplanted after its 2nd year. So in the wild simulated system, you'll want to sow seed in the fall. We're sowing seed right now and through the month of October, some even a little bit later, depending on when you have it. And with the method that was seen on some of the previous slides. One way to do this on a large scale is to weigh out little baggies of seed, 1/4 ounce, for example, for a specific area for 10 by 10 square feet. So you can start a little plot that way. And we have some resources on numbers for that if you're interested. In the woods grown system, you can mechanize to be more efficient, and you're going to have a way higher seeding rate, which results in these high populations that are going to require more management. That said, there are some neat ways that folks have learned how to do this in a larger scale. There's one of these kind of plunger or spring planters, and we've seen a number of different planting tools for these seeds over the years. So here we are in that wild simulated system again. Actually, that's Scott Parsons himself developed that method of raking in that seed lightly, walk over them or dance, and then step up to plant another strip. And that's become a popular wild simulated method. Do note that the seedlings of ginseng look different from the mature plants. And we saw a little bit of this in the diagram in the last presentation. The ginseng seedling just has 3 little leaves. It can be mistaken for a lot of other plants on the forest floor, even brambles. And it has this tiny little rootlet. So this is a 1-year-old seedling. When it gets larger, we're already out to, these are kind of, they're over each other, the plants. I'm trying to count the leaves. These are 3-year prong plants, some 2 as well, probably a 5-year patch there as we're starting to see the flowering and all. So growing ginseng from rootlets is an option as well, and they're more and more available, which is interesting, even from places such as Johnny's and maybe other local folks you have there. I'm not sure of the regulations surrounding rootlet and trade, so maybe we could cover that in the question period after. But again, rootlets are sold and transplanted at 1 and 2 years old, and they will be more expensive depending on their age, but we wouldn't recommend growing, especially if they're bare root, from anything older than 2 years. If possible. You can plant these in late fall or early spring as well. They're like a dormant root plant. And again, make sure you're covering those with a nice leaf mulch or similar. Here's a picture of some 1-year-old, and there's some 2-year-old, I think, based on size, rootlets in there that we planted with our Woodland Stewards group, which is one of our extension groups last month. So this is a site we're expanding on. We're planting them about trenches in kind of a 12-inch by 12-inch pattern, which is one of our wild simulated methods. Once you have planted that ginseng patch, you need to be sure to do some maintenance with it regular. It's often thought that you throw the seeds, they grow on their own, and you come back in 10, 15 years and there's your ginseng patch. You can do that. But if you help them, especially in the first couple of years, to get established, you'll have a much better success rate. Also note that you will get a lot of natural thinning. So not all plants will make it to mature age. And that is part of what happens, particularly in the wild. So we recommend visiting your sites regularly. Look for signs of voles, disease, insects, and theft. Ginseng theft is often referred to as ginseng poaching, but if you've planted these plants and it's on your land and you're cultivating it and you've documented, I really think it should be considered theft. You may have other things to contend with, fallen trees or erosion from a rainstorm. Also weeds or invasives that have come in, which can be an issue when you have a cleared area. So identifying insects and diseases, it takes good observational skills. When you see a plant that's yellow like the one on the right, it's like, oh yeah, there might be something wrong with that, especially if it's not during the time of year that the plant should be dying back or senescing. I've circled here, it's just some leaf symptoms, but it took a trained eye to see the first plant that may have been affected in this patch of many ginseng plants. Prevention is the best approach to having issues with insects and diseases. And the more wild simulated your style of growing is, the less issues we usually see. So there's a gamble there between, what you have access to, your resources, your space, and then your goals in cultivating ginseng, and what you're willing to do to reach those goals. Healthy soil is really important and number one. It's one of the reasons why ginseng doesn't grow that well unless it's intensively cultivated outside of its range, and it still doesn't grow to the best quality. And that's often because of the biology that's going on in the soil and the interrelations with everything going on in our magical, frankly, forest soil. We don't really understand it all yet, but we know when things do well and when they don't. Do not overwater or even fertilize these plants. Sometimes we're in a state of mind, if we're growing a vegetable garden, that more is better. In this case, it's not. And planting a diversity of plants can help to keep that diversity high and as part of your IPM strategy. All right. Other creatures and other ways of looking at them and working with them for management are game camps. Deer is probably that good one. And there were some questions in the chat about deer. Deer like ginseng. They love ginseng berries, especially. We'll see, new young deer in our woods will come and nibble on the ginseng in the spring. Most find something else they prefer, so planting something else can be a deterrent too. Ours really like Solomon seal and spikenard over the ginseng most of the year. But then for whatever reason, those seeds come out, they see that berry and want to snack again. So be mindful of all these kinds of pests. There are some strategies, which I won't get into in detail tonight, but there are some strategies out there for working with these. Some of them include physical barriers, and we're talking about for herbivores as well as moles or voles that might grab your root from the bottom and yank it down through a hole, such as in this picture, right in a row, 1, 2, 3. Cages, especially for seedlings, other types of barriers. And then the bottom right picture is one that's worked really well for deer for me, for some of our sites. And it's a tape, a white tape, like an electric fence tape, but it's not charged all the time. And we have it in kind of a perimeter fence at different heights and different depths to try to confuse the deers to not want to go in there. In addition to our herbivores, we also have human theft. And that's a real thing. If ginseng is not as common to be cultivated in Georgia, you may be in good hands in terms of awareness that you have it growing. But think about security with all your plantings. And there's a lot of strategies for that. We could discuss at another time. As Lisa mentioned about the harvest, there is a season, and that's whether you're cultivating these plants or digging them if there were permissions for that in your area. So when we talk about harvest, I really want to introduce that. We do start to see leaf markets, and we do see that the ginsenosides and some of the medicinal constituents present in the root are also present in the leaf. So I also want to encourage this, as it can be a more sustainable harvest than harvesting the root. You don't want to take all of it, and you want to make sure that the plant has a chance to grow through the season before harvesting the leaf. You can also harvest seed to replant or for sale. Harvesting roots in the cultivated markets require a minimum of 5 years, but more often we're seeing closer to 10 years where it's a valuable time to harvest those roots. When you're harvesting plants, you really want to protect that integrity of the crop, like a 10-year crop, really maintain that, how wonderful it is, how beautiful it is through the harvest and post-harvest handling. These are two gorgeous 4-prong plants that we have in our woods. They have kind of the green flower stage on them. And when we asked about aging, I've had a lot of neat opportunities to age some pretty old plants, whether they're from poached events in our forest, the Nantahala and Pisgah up here in North Carolina, or from some collections that were kept at the Arboretum. But the oldest one I've aged was 47, and that was nine years ago. So that's the oldest plant that I have in my collection right now. So 56 years old. That is older than me. And it's just amazing to work with these plants. So if you're harvesting these plants, again, looking at some different ways of growing them really affects what they look like. So that intensively grown root, that slick root from the woods grown shade covered beds to a woods grown root, and to an even more wild looking, wild simulated root. So post-harvest handling, I'll talk about real quick. You may want to, but you really shouldn't wash the roots. That little dirt on there in certain ways are part of how the ginseng is quantified and qualified. You don't want it to be full of soil or dirt, or definitely any other contaminants, but you will want to talk with your potential buyer or where that root might be ending up about handling that after harvest. For optimal prices, you might want to consider if you're cultivated ginseng certified organic, or a newer certification in the area called forest grown. You can reach out to me about that later if you have questions. Some other things, if your ginseng is going to be for sale to someone that's going to put it into medicine, you may have to also do heavy metal tests, pesticides, or other things like that. Also be sure that if you're growing and harvesting these roots after so much labor and good work, that you're handling and storing them properly to maintain that integrity and not waste the material. Drying herbs and roots. So this shows some leaves drying in various methods and kind of a modified shed dryer. There is a green market for ginseng, and one of the graphs in Lisa's presentation alluded to that was a small portion of the sales or of the output in the last 5-10 years especially. So look to those markets if you're not familiar with drying. Otherwise, you're definitely going to want to dry a test batch. And we can go into details on that another time. If you are growing this and wanting to cultivate it, it can be really easy to get dollar signs in your eyes, so to speak. We really want to recommend that you be realistic if you have any financial expectations about cultivated ginseng beyond a patch for yourself or for your grandkids, maybe. Forest farming, ginseng, and other woodland botanicals really provides a supplement income in most cases and is often part of a diversified operation. We gave an example of these folks in West Virginia called Shady Grove Botanicals. Ed and Carol Daniels become good friends of mine. Just recognizing that it takes a long time for ginseng to reach a harvestable size. A lot can happen during that time. And most of these forest farmers have success because they're really diversified, kind of full operations. They're doing product development, they're doing seed sales, they're doing value added, they're doing education. And in some cases might even be, in this case, Ed, the gentleman here, is a ginseng dealer in his state as well. So some suggested reading, the book I mentioned, and the green cover here, Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals, is one I would highly recommend, co-authored by my boss, Janine Davis, and Scott Parsons. Here are some of the other books. One that's hot off the press in the last couple of years, which is a novel, but is really fascinating, is by our own NC Cooperative Extension, Jim Hamilton. He's director up in the northern counties here in North Carolina, and he wrote the last entry about the ginseng hunt and what it means for him and his family. Additionally, if you'd like to find technical information or information about our programming in Western North Carolina, our website is ncurb.org. Here's a picture of our Woodland Stewards group that meets monthly to go through the seasons and our demonstration forest with forest farming crops. The Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition. If you haven't been to this website yet, please join, become a member. We're over 2,000 members strong, and membership means you're on our mailing list and have access to our resources, and it's free. I'm the associate director for this group, and it's really been an amazing collaboration. We're in our 7th year. And I could tell you more about that if you're interested, or go to the website. There's a YouTube forest farming channel linked from there that has hundreds of videos on forest farming and other agroforestry topics. We are doing Forest Farming Friday Autumn office hours. I host those, and we have 2 more coming up that you're welcome to join us on October 14th and 28th. We just talk. We meet over lunch over Zoom, usually from 5 to 20 people. And talk about all things forest farming, look at resources online. So please join us if you're interested in that. I can send the Zoom link to Jacob, or you can email me for it. And that is all I have today. I know I may be a little bit behind schedule, so I want to stop now and put it back to you, Jacob.
Thank you, Margaret. That was fantastic. Really enjoyed that. I think one question that was in the chat I don't think you really talked about was a question about propagating by, taking cuttings or using tissue culture, anything like that.
Sure. So it's not really popular way to do it, but there is some tissue culture work going on. And there's a really fascinating woman, Iris Gow, over at Middle Tennessee State University, excuse me. She's got the International Ginseng Institute over there that's a few years young, and she works with tissue culture. So it is possible, and she is working on that as a source to look at the genetics of ginseng and to hopefully help as a propagation technique. However, even for tissue culture, from her, what she's shared with me is it's rather challenging to use for ginseng under tissue culture. So if you're talented in that, by all means, go for it. And I would be happy to connect you with some people doing it. But the most common way to propagate ginseng is by the seed. It's not something that if you cut the root, it's going to grow to from the root. You need to have that neck and that apical bud, as shown in the previous diagrams, to regrow. There's actually studies out that look at what we call the distal and histal, like the top end and the bottom end, like the head end and the tail end, if you try to clone a ginseng plant that way, and it doesn't work. So stick with the seed, and then, of course, the rootlets if you have access to the young plants.
All right. Thank you, Margaret. I really appreciate that.
You're very welcome.
We'll keep on moving. I think Holly is here.
Hey, okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Great. Okay, does that look all right?
Yep, there it is.
Great. So I apologize to everyone. I wasn't able to join the first part of the program. Jacob, I don't know if you introduced the speakers. If you would like me to say a little bit about myself, I can do that getting started.
Yeah, you can introduce yourself. I kind of just did it really briefly at the very beginning.
Okay. Yeah, so my name's Holly Campbell, and I'm part of our outreach faculty at the UGA Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. And in that position, I have primarily sort of an outreach, we call it outreach, it's sort of extension like appointment. And I wear a few hats as far as the subject areas that I cover, everywhere from community forestry to wildland fire, to natural history, dendrology, teach undergraduate, graduate classes, as well as do a variety of professional public programming. But last year, I introduced a pilot course on wild harvesting in Georgia. And this year, the course was made official. It's an undergraduate class out of the Warnell School. And I've also been doing a variety of programs around the state in wild harvesting. And one thing that, including actually with one of our Spalding County Cooperative Extension agents, Brooklyn Wassel, we've started a year-long Master Forager program. And so she's sort of the head of that, and I'm one of the presenters for it. But one thing that I really like to emphasize throughout the programming that I do and in my undergraduate class is sustainable and ethical harvesting. So we definitely talk about American ginseng. I have them read some research articles on it, looking at occurrence, abundance of it, and the precipitous decline in its abundance. And so I'm very interested in promoting that. And so I was really excited that Jacob asked me to be part of this presentation. I probably don't have the same sort of expertise as our previous two speakers in the fact that I haven't grown it. And I haven't worked with some of the laws in the state with it, but I am an educator of American ginseng, and I definitely want to keep that ethical and sustainable harvesting at the forefront of my students' knowledge in approaching this plant and other plants that are rare and threatened and potentially edging on endangered. Okay, so today I wanted to talk, and some of this has probably already been spoken about by the other speakers, so there's going to be maybe a little bit of repeat. And this is threads that are woven sort of in some of the laws, some of the regulations around American ginseng, and also growing and cultivating American ginseng. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the history. And I'm going to start with natural history because that's, I think, understanding a plant is essential before you ever go out, even think about harvesting it or cultivating it. So a lot of the names already been mentioned: Panax quinquefolius, it's in the Eriliaceae, I'm not going to say it, Eriliaceae family. I probably mispronounced that. And as others mentioned, this plant really prefers these rich, moist, kind of semi-shaded areas, hardwood forests, sort of these coves and ravines and along stream banks. So it has some specific habitat that it enjoys. And I'm looking at a map here. I really had a hard time finding a range map that I liked, but this map that was off of a research article by Schmidt et al. In 2019, looking at some of the decline in American ginseng across Appalachia. This is federal and state lands overlaid over TNC ecoregions where an occurrence of American ginseng has been noted. So we know that that Piedmont, and if we're looking specifically at Georgia, the Piedmont and the mountains region is definitely within its native range. I saw other range maps that also included the coastal plains, but I really liked this map because it said that it did have occurrence data that occurred with it. So kind of getting an idea of where it occurs within Georgia. Again, another typical habitat where ginseng may occur. And then I want to think about, or I would like all of us to think about, how this plant has been utilized. And, you know, unfortunately, we lost a lot of the cultural uses and the medicinal value that this plant has had with the cultures that occupied these lands for thousands of years before Europeans arrived and other immigrants came into the southeastern United States. And not even just the southeast, all the way up until the east, covering American ginseng's range. And so just looking at specific tribes, and I don't have all tribes within Georgia, but if we're looking at the Muskogee Nation, or otherwise known as the Creek Nation, ginseng, American ginseng, was a plant that was utilized by the Muskogee. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name that they used for this plant, but it had a couple of different uses, some that were sort of energetic, spiritual, some that were actually addressing physical ailments, so used for shortness of breath. It was considered a tonic that would be used in a long-term capacity following a heart attack. It was also used for good luck. so worn about the body. And it was used with a soap-like herb to actually wash off a bad spell that someone was said to have placed on you. So it had a couple of qualities that was utilized by this nation. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians also utilize the plant, still utilize the plant today. And I'm, again, not going to try to pronounce the name that is applied to it, but it was used as sort of a cure-all, like an overall restorative tonic, helped to increase appetite and energy, sort of an immunomodulator, so helps with regulating, moderating the immune system. And it had a lot of different uses for various ailments, but I would say a cure-all was one of the overall uses of this plant by the Cherokee, but even as sort of directed a use as treating vertigo, can't say that, and also is a mouthwash for thrush and other types of mouth ailments. So specific uses, more general uses, but definitely an important plant for several nations. So I liked this quote here by William Bartram at the bottom, and it was saying, the Cherokees speak of the plant as a sentient being, able to make itself invisible to those unworthy to gather it. So it really held a place of importance for the people that are still here today, but not covering the same lands that they once did. So I do sort of lament that we lost a lot by our treatment of the native peoples, the first peoples. So after Europeans and other immigrants started to come to the Southeast, even early explorers, there was notice that there was this plant, and this plant had very similar uses and looked very similarly to, and was noted to be related to Asian ginseng species. And so this was sort of around the same time. I guess we're looking more in the 1700s when Asian ginseng was starting to become really hard to find because it had also been overharvested. And so there was a lot of interest in this very similar plant that was coming out of the American colony. And so this sort of initiated this export market. So I've listed the names here for American ginseng in Cantonese and Mandarin. And so here's an image here of American ginseng being sold in an Asian market. And so this kind of is in part why we're here today, is that there's a strong demand for this plant. And it's created a lot of wonderful things for people, but it's also created a lot of challenges. And so strong market, and as others have mentioned, wild cultivated ginseng is what is preferred for a variety of reasons. Okay. All right, so I wanted to go over a couple of bits of the history. And so I call it a lesson in conservation because this has been a lesson in conservation, and this is one example of many natural resources that we have had to learn the hard way, and how to take care of our natural resources, and that they're not unending in supply. And I think it's been a big growing pains and great learning lesson for this country in particular. So since the early 1700s, there have been very large harvests of American ginseng coming out of the Appalachian region, out of American ginseng's range, and they have been exported to China. And this has been a really valuable source of income for a lot of people living in Appalachia, especially in the southern Appalachian region. And, roots harvested could be traded for basic necessities, food or firewood or fabric to make clothing. And so it was a very important commodity in a part of the country that maybe there wasn't a lot of wealth at that time. And so it really supported that self-sufficiency in Appalachia. So William Bartram, and at some point, this was a plant that was fairly abundant, and that is seen by the numbers, the sheer numbers of pounds that were being exported, harvested and exported on a yearly basis. So William Bartram in 1776, so around signing of Declaration of Independence, reported that American ginseng appears plentifully on north-facing slopes in the South Carolina foothills. So, there's been a lot of change to those foothills that haven't just included harvesting, but at one point, this was a fairly plentiful herb. And there may have been a variety of reasons why it was so plentiful. Could have had to do with land use at that time before Europeans even came into this country. So, sorry, my slide is not advancing. Jacob, my slide's not advancing. I don't know if there's like I'll stop sharing and restart. Maybe that'll help.
Okay.
That's interesting. Okay. So the Civil War was notably very hard on the South. And this was a time where there was an acceleration of ginseng harvest after the Civil War because people were in financial dire straits, as we know about the history of Georgia, especially, and in a lot of the other Appalachian states. So after the Civil War, the 3 years following the Civil War, the U.S. exported about 1.4 million pounds of ginseng. And this was quite a harvest. This really spoke to the need for that income. And so a lot of people facing the devastation following the Civil War, they headed out into the woods and they found what they could and they harvested it and they sold it. And that was probably a large part of their survival in such a hard time in the history of our country. So following the Civil War and moving beyond that time period, we were harvesting about 400,000 pounds a year for, let's see, over 2 decades. There was a lot coming out of Appalachia and being sold and exported. And then following that time, so following about 1890s, there was a rapid decline in the quantity that was being harvested. And with that coinciding this steady increase in price per pound. I think it was, I can't remember how many years it occurred over, but the price tripled. And at that time, maybe it was only $4 a pound, which doesn't seem like a lot to us, but that was a lot for people in the 1800s, especially after the Civil War. So some other of the speakers had talked about some of these declines. Why was there this decline in population? Well, there was overharvest, clearly, and that was taking a steep toll on the population of American ginseng. But also at the time, at the end of the 1800s and coming into the early 1900s, this is when almost all of the Appalachian region was deforested. And I think that, I'm sorry if a previous speaker has already talked about this, but this was a huge land use change for this region. So timber was extracted. We know that American ginseng requires a certain type of habitat. And so if that habitat changes, then it's really difficult for the plant to survive. So considering the deforestation and the degree of deforestation that happened at that time, it's amazing that we have as much American ginseng as we have left, considering the harvest pressure on it. So it's not that we have that much left, but so deforestation took a huge toll on the plant. There's also at that time a misunderstanding of how to reproduce the plant. A lot of American ginseng was being sold at various times of the year. They'd have, like, some of it would start coming into grocery stores, markets in May, June, outside of that harvest season. And so, the plant's root is dug up. And so the plant is removed at that point if you don't have those seeds to replant. And then sometimes people weren't even planting it when it had reached that maturity. So that took a little bit of knowledge gained to understand how to propagate the plant. And then at that time in our nation's history, there really just wasn't a strong conservation ethic. We were still living on this kind of manifest destiny idea about this country. And it was also growing pains for us again in learning how to manage our open access resources, looking at these common resources that were once seen as that, oh, well, that's everybody's. If I find it, it's mine. It's mine to do with what I want to do with it. And it's historically been very hard to manage open access resources. And so this was managing this plant and keeping it from being endangered is, some of the states, for example, noticed that there was a sharp decline. And so Georgia was one of the first states to institute a harvest season. And so starting to restrict the harvest as it noticed the abundance of the species going down. So in 1868, they began promoting a harvest season, which selling was beginning in about September 1st, which is pretty much what is being followed now. Okay, so if we're just focusing on kind of these range-wide harvests, I couldn't find potential prices for 2022. Another speaker may have mentioned that. But I did in the Indiana Ginseng annual report for 2020, 2021, I saw $600 per pound. So that another speaker may have noted another number for that, but you see why people harvest it. It garners a high price. Now collecting a pound of it is a bit of ginseng to harvest, but that's appealing to folks. And so I don't know if anyone's seen this show, but it's kind of, I'm spacing on the exact name of it, but I've talked about it with my students before, and it's sort of highlighted the American ginseng harvest and Appalachian harvest of woodland species, non-timber forest crops. But the downside of this show is that it brought more awareness to American ginseng and sort of encouraged more people to go out and harvest American ginseng. At least that is the criticism that I've heard of the show. And it's also sort of dramatizes it. And so I don't know, maybe some of you have enjoyed this show, but I've read a lot of criticisms of the fact that it has highlighted this very increasingly rare threatened plant that is overharvested. So this article by Schmidt et al. From 2019 was really looking over several decades by looking at some factors that influence American ginseng abundance. And this isn't necessarily in Georgia, though Georgia includes about 18 states and harvest data over several decades, but it was really looking at where harvest rates increase. And it noted that the areas of increase are in areas with a high amount of poverty, a higher amount of unemployment, available habitat. So that takes a little bit of know-how and understanding where that preferred habitat is. Also, the density of roads had a big impact on increased harvest. So that's about accessibility of the plant. And it was noted that the harvests were greatest in the southern Appalachian states, especially Kentucky. So for moving to Georgia, and I really wish that I had found more information on the history of Georgia harvests, but I really had a hard time. I did a lot of research and I kept looking for articles. I like that 1970s article that the previous speaker pointed out and talking about cultivating American ginseng. But this is sort of looking at this study. Well, it was looking at an accumulation of studies, kind of a review by Chamberlain et al. 2017, and was looking at American ginseng and saw palmetto harvest in a couple of areas. And this was a map that included some data from Georgia, which I was excited about because I was having a hard time finding information. And it's showing that though we do have harvest from some counties, especially some of our mountain counties, that the harvest is fairly low compared to some of the other states. And I believe this map here was from 2001 to 2007. And then to move the little thumbnails of our video here off my slide, but then this is looking at 2009 to 2013 pounds of permanent wild harvested ginseng, specifically from national forests, so federal lands, looking at the Chattahoochee Oconee forest and showing the various pounds that were harvested in Georgia. And you can see that these numbers, maybe compared to Tennessee, aren't necessarily they're higher than maybe found in Tennessee, but compared to some of the other states like Kentucky and North Carolina, especially North Carolina here, they're fairly low. So it's not a state that, in comparison to other Southern Appalachian states, that has a high degree of harvest. So I saw on the, was it Lisa Cruz? I may have your name wrong, but on the Georgia DNR page that there were 100 Georgia populations that have been documented over the last half century of American ginseng, but really their abundance today and more information about them is fairly unknown. And so we do know that we have had populations, but having the resources to monitor them is more difficult. So I did notice that the Chattahoochee Oconee National Forest, as well as the Pisgah National Forest, ceased issuing permits because of decreased abundance, and they're really concerned about their wild populations. And there's a lot of efforts to try to plant more within the national forest and to manage and sustain the populations that they have and increase the populations that they have. So there are fines that may have been mentioned earlier in the presentation, up to $5,000 or 6 months in a federal prison if you're caught harvesting on these federal lands. So if we're looking at decline in population today, and I think that this applies to several states, but also to Georgia, definitely overharvest, still an issue, Herbivory is also an issue. It's interesting, when we looked at deer herbivory, deer, okay, unlike humans, we dig up the root, we take the plant, and maybe we replant seeds, but that doesn't necessarily mean all of them are going to germinate. Deer, more often than not, just nibble on a couple of leaves, and they don't pull the plant out of the ground, especially if it's a well-established plant. And so it could be argued that they're doing less damage than humans are in harvesting. So deer tend to nibble here, nibble there, and they don't always fully consume an entire plant. Some other animals have been a little bit harder on the plants, like voles, eating the roots and nibbling at the roots, so potentially damaging the roots, especially if they're going to be harvested. Fungal diseases can be an issue. Deforestation is still problematic. And that goes hand in hand with development and land conversion. So urbanization, just developing areas, changing that preferred habitat, changing the ecosystem, changing the drainage of a site, removing topsoil. So there's a lot going on, a lot of land use change, again, that continues to happen. Climate change also has an impact. And also, I read a little bit about invasive species. This really depends on the site and what kind of species would be competing with American ginseng. And so I didn't have any specific, I kind of feel like microstegia might be an issue, but I'm not sure because I didn't see anything specifically about that, but definitely still a lot of challenges today. So I wanted to go through a couple of the uses. So that I'm not really going to go through everything on this slide. So again, I teach a wild harvesting in Georgia class. These are typical of the slides that I use with my students. And we always talk about the part that's harvested. I highly encourage cultivated roots as opposed to wild harvested. We talk about the season of harvest. I'm sure a lot of this has already been gone over, talking about what you look for when you're harvesting, and then planting the ripe fruit afterwards. looking for these compound leaves and needing more than 3 of the compound leaves on the plant. And a lot of these other requirements. So about where you can harvest, getting permission, gathering permits. And I really want to end with, it's better to cultivate this plant versus wild harvested. And that was very well illustrated in the previous presentation. This is just one of those plants. And I want to say this, and maybe this is going to be controversial with some folks, but I want to say it. So I'm not trying to make a criticism of traditional Chinese medicine, and I hope this doesn't sound like that, because I think it's really valuable. It's a really important system, and I know that it's not just about the physical plant; it's also about energetics. And so I want to be careful when I say this, but another type of natural item that is used in traditional Chinese medicine is rhino horn or other types of horn, and it's made of keratin. Keratin is what our fingernails are made out of. And I'm trying to illustrate the fact that I know that there's an energetic component there, but if you're dealing, it's apples and apples as far as just the actual physical material. I'm thinking about cultivated ginseng versus wild-grown ginseng. And I don't know if there's any studies that have looked at chemical components of the chemical profile of wild ginseng versus cultivated ginseng, but I am guessing it's very similar. And so I'm hopeful in the future as we move forward that we move away from the look of a root and looking at more of the components of that root. As the raw chemical components, the raw physical components, and we can really stop over harvesting this plant, just like over harvesting threatened and endangered animals for certain substances that they provide. So again, I'm not trying to criticize a certain type of medicine. I know that it sounds like that, but I really want to emphasize this last sentence. It is better to cultivate this plant versus wild harvest. And moving forward in the future, I really hope that that is the direction that we're going in with this plant in particular. So I'll get off my soapbox on that. But okay, so once you have your ideally cultivated American ginseng root and you want to utilize it for medicine or a flavorful tea, you want to wash the root, be that a dry or a fresh root. Then you dry it slightly at room temperature. And there's a couple of ways that it's processed. So it's typically made into a tea or a tincture. It is also powdered. So when we talk about what a decoction is when you have water and you add the herb. So 1 cup of water to either 1 teaspoon of finely chopped herb, very finely chopped, so increasing the surface area, or 1 tablespoon of coarsely chopped herb. You add that to your water. You slowly bring the water up to a low boil, just low, turn the temperature down, and then you simmer it for about 20 minutes. In Asian cultures, I read that it's simmered often for an hour, but the idea is that you're not really boiling it. It's just a low heat. You can also make an infusion, which is typically how people make tea, but that would be with the finely chopped root. And that's when you boil water, you add your herb to the cup, and then you pour that boiled water over it and you let it steep for 5 to 10 minutes. You strain off the herb and then you drink the tea, but you're dealing with a root here. And so typically it's decocted to make a tea with. So I would recommend that. That was the recommendations that I found in several herbal books. It's also tinctured. So if you have fresh root, you can make a 1 to 2 tinctures. So that's 1 part plant material, usually measured in grams, to 2 parts what's called a menstruum. And that's measured in milliliters. Menstruum is typically alcohol and water. So when you buy alcohol, so let's say 100 proof like vodka, it's 50% alcohol, 50% water. And so the water and the alcohol provide the agent that is extracting the chemical components of the herb. So a tincture is something that's very long lasting and can preserve the components of that herb. And then you can also do a dry root tincture, which is 1 to 5. So 1 part plant material to 5 parts of your alcohol. And then sometimes people powder the herb and utilize it in capsules. I don't have as much information about how to utilize that, and that's not something I personally use. So I don't want to not speak with some authority about it. Okay, so I want to just go over some of the actions here. Herbal medicine use. So this typically, as an herbal medicine, is used as something called an adaptogen. An adaptogen is something that's thought to help your body react to stress. It's considered an immunomodulator. So if you have stress to your system, it helps kind of balance out that stress and enables your body to adapt to that stress more easily. A tonic is kind of a full nutritive system support herb, and a stimulant. I think we all know what that is. So those are some of the main ways that it's used by Western herbalism. One of the main constituents of interest is the I'm going to say this wrong, ginsenoside. I wanted to put the chemical structure of it, and I came across so many versions of that online that I didn't want to put the wrong thing up. So I just left it off, but it has a really interesting chemical structure. So I do want to talk a little bit about some research that's occurred with American ginseng. So with herbal medicine use, I did study herbal medicine for several years at a few different schools, but a lot of the uses that are used in herbal medicine aren't necessarily backed by research. And so there's a lot of folk uses. It's kind of like, well, this is what we've observed, kind of anecdotal evidence of use. I'm more of a research-based. I like to see research about it and see what this plant actually, what kind of actions it actually has in the body. And so that's my interest. And so I looked into some of the research of it. And so one study suggested a positive effect on neurocognitive function and memory. Well, not just one study, several studies supported this. And so there's some growing research in that area. Another study suggested a potential application for the treatment of prostate cancer. So I thought that was interesting. That's a newer research study. And so if you bought herb and you either buy it fresh or you've dried it, storing it is very important. This is a very expensive herb. Even if you're buying cultivated, it tends to be more expensive than some of the other plants that are purchased. And so you want to take care of it, take care of what you've invested in. And also, if you come across wild harvested American ginseng, this is a treasure. And so I highly recommend you take care of it very well and store it in a way so it's not being wasted. So drying it and then storing it in, once it's fully dry, storing it in a lidded jar in a cool, dark pantry is recommended. So there are some precautions in using American ginseng. So it has been shown to reduce the efficacy of warfarin, which is a blood thinning drug. So definitely be careful if you are on that particular drug. And that's all I have. If you have any questions, especially about my wild harvest class, it's called Fanner 3600, Wild Harvesting in Georgia. I'd love to tell you more about it, especially if you have students that or relatives that are at UGA. I have a couple of resources here. There's a new book out by Luke Manget, which talks a lot about the history of American ginseng harvest, called Ginseng Diggers, A History of Root and Herb Gathering in Appalachia. And I also wanted to point out a place that I buy from, a lot of herbs from, is Mountain Rose Herbal Products, and they do have cultivated American ginseng root for sale. There's probably other places as well, but they're a good company. Okay, thanks so much.
All right, well, thank you, Holly. Appreciate you taking the time to share with us, and also appreciate Margaret and Lisa spending the evening with us, sharing a little bit about ginseng with everybody. Yeah, just thank all of you guys for joining us. Let me post in here real quick. I'm going to put in the chat a link for the survey. If you don't mind opening that, filling that out, just about the program here. And thank you all for coming.